Um, I'm going to speak about Galen, but I also am concerned with why we would want to know about ancient diet and nutrition, how it fits into ancient studies, how it fits into modern concerns. And so I have a few preliminary slides to get us into the kind of area. First of all, Galen himself, as many of you will know, his work is mostly from the 2nd century AD. He may have died in 215, according to Arabic sources. And as physician to the Roman emperors, he might be considered to be one of those elite authors who might be thought to know little about how most people ate. And that's why I have famine and social class in the title, because I want to see Galen within the larger social picture, and not just as somebody writing for the elite. Although as a learned doctor, he is writing for the learned elite, and very consciously so. He also produced a massive output, which is quite a challenge to modern scholars. Very few people have read all of them. And he considered himself to be a philosopher, like the Emperor Marcus Aurelius. And he was very much writing in the tradition of Aristotle and Plato. So what understanding can he have of the diet as most people understood it and experienced it in the ancient world? So a couple of slides now on the topic of food in antiquity. Most people thought of food as something which was wrestled out of an unwilling natural world. Life was hard, as Hesiod and many others had described it. The gods who controlled the natural world required sacrifice and honor and worship from human beings. And food could only be guaranteed if Dionysus, Demeter, the other food gods could be persuaded to allow the natural world to function in a human-friendly way. Galen is not interested in sacrifice. He is interested in regional foods, and I'll come back onto that shortly. But when ancient writers are writing about food, they are very interested in regional foods. For example, Spartan food was very different from Athenian food. And they were very interested in identity, particularly in the interesting cases of Rome and Athens, claiming to have quite a simple and non-luxurious diet compared in the Roman case with their Greek predecessors, and in the Athenian case with the Persian Empire. So a good food identity was linked to quite a simple diet in the Roman case. Emmer porridge and preserved pork was what the early Romans were considered to have eaten, and certainly no fish. And this identity in the Roman Republic or in 5th century Athens was linked to a lot of philosophical and historical writing, where luxury was seen as, this is all very familiar to my audience, I'm sure, luxury was seen as a dangerous thing. Pleasure was to be kept very much under control. And too much luxury, too much pleasure would lead to disaster, as in the end of the Persian Empire and the Romans taking over the Greek world. So virtue, identity, the virtuous subsistence farmer was what people, an idea of food that people attached to themselves. And this is particularly clear in Roman history, where that early republican simplicity could be contrasted with the excesses of the imperial period, which of course, from another perspective, from a modern perspective, could be seen as an enormous success story. The extent of the empire, the new foods that came in, the food supplies from Egypt and the Black Sea. This was success, but food could very easily be seen as a problem, something to be wary of, even though it's part of everyday life. It's a really interesting sort of discourse going on there. And certain foods were particularly linked with taste and pleasure. The most surprising, excuse me, to a modern eye is fish and imported foods, luxury foods like guinea fowl and peaches and anything that came into the Mediterranean from further afield. So imperial success in drawing goods to the center was seen as a potential threat to our identity as virtuous Roman Republican people. Cookery books were certainly linked with an ability to choose and with luxurious living. All of this, of course, a problem which wealthy and elite people had. It was not a problem to the ordinary people of Greece and Rome. But cookery books were also linked with medicine. And most works on food that we know about were written by medical authors. There are very few cookery books not written by doctors. So writing about food was a medical area in ancient thought. And medicine, of course, is a cultural product. It comes with many assumptions. But one of the big assumptions that ancient medicine has is that it's dealing with the human body, rather than the body of a starling or the body of a quail or the body of a camel. The human body is a really important focus. And this is one way in which Galen helps us to see how the diet was working for a wide section of the community. He wasn't particularly interested in what was happening in the imperial family, for example. In the modern world, if people are writing about food in antiquity, the luxury and pleasure story is still dominant, I think, in modern studies. There's much interest in the very varied climate in the Mediterranean, Horden and Purcell, for example, in 2000. Archaeology is contributing a huge amount. I'll come on later to the Herculaneum sewer, which has given us invaluable information about the Roman diet in the 1st century AD. And of course, archaeology is now looking at bones and seeds and fish bones, things that were thrown away 50 years ago, but are now closely studied. They're also looking at DNA identification, also important. There's been much work on the strategies of subsistence farmers. How do small producers survive crop failures, which happen quite often in the Mediterranean climate? There's been much interest over a long period in grain supplies to Rome and Athens, social unrest that might follow food shortages in large cities. And from a nutrition point of view, Vivian Nutton has written that nothing in Galen's nutrition would upset a modern nutritionist. So even though, as we'll see, it's a very different nutrition from modern ideas of nutrition, it's broadly approaching the human body in a similar way from a completely different perspective. The Mediterranean diet, a final note I'd make, the Mediterranean diet, as promulgated by UNESCO and other world bodies, now considered to be very healthy, focusing on cereals and vegetables and fruit much more than meat and highly processed products, does have big disadvantages, as we'll see shortly, particularly shortages of food in the spring. Hence, a large number of people who had to leave the Mediterranean world and go and live in Australia and the United States. They were forced there by insufficient food resources, among other things. Now, Galen wrote a treatise on the capacities of foods, which I'll spend quite a lot of time on in this talk. And he says there that nutrition is a third of the medical art. This is a very different perspective from what you study in medical school now, as I understand it. So pharmacology, surgery, and nutrition, that is one of Galen's numerous divisions of medicine. And it belongs to the field of pharmacology. Fabrizio mentioned that I was working on simple medicines at the moment. And right at the beginning of simple medicines, Galen says, food maintains the body in its current state, whereas drugs alter it, change it. So things are taken into the body, and the food is that large area which keeps it in a healthy state, ideally. Galen, as an elite writer of the 2nd century AD, is determined to present his empire-wide knowledge, his imperial credentials. There's nothing Galen doesn't know, in effect. But he doesn't have any interest in those things I mentioned earlier, such as he's not interested in a luxurious diet at all. And as I'll mention shortly, it dismisses the nutritional value of the head of a red mullet or the liver of a red mullet that Pliny says was much sought after by the Roman gourmet. Galen is interested in the standard diet, where we come back to what the majority of the population were eating, and he has much regional comment. He has a really interesting nutritional theory, which I'll outline very briefly, and he most certainly is one of our best sources on regular food shortages in the ancient world. So first of all, a word on his range. He's interested in foods in cereals from Italy, wheat, hard wheats, for example. He's interested in the Black Sea. Millet grows in the Black Sea. He's interested in rye in Thrace, in emmer in Western Asia Minor. So that is his imperial range that I was mentioning earlier. His interest in fish extends from Spain, the Western Mediterranean, to tuna in the Black Sea. Again, a very wide interest, far beyond the concerns of Italy, where he spent most of his life. And in Galen's account, the majority of foods that were eaten come from agriculture. Fish are wild animals, and Galen has quite positive things to say about fish that I'll come on to. But his notion of a healthy human being is one living on agricultural products, and wild and raw foods are too strong for the human digestive system. This is an idea he's got from much earlier, from the time of Hippocrates. Doctors have been saying this. So cows and horses can eat wild grasses. Human beings can't. They need food to be processed, preferably the production from agriculture, but certainly cooked. They must be cooked in ways that animals don't need. But not everyone is the same. And people like us, the elegant members of the Roman elite, cannot tolerate foods which country people can eat. And this is an interesting area that I will return to. Some people are simply very different from us. The Egyptians eat snakes and insects, which Galen finds far beyond the pale. And he says, I'm not going to write about those foods. And similarly, the Egyptians are not going to read what I'm writing. So there's just no cultural understanding between us and Egyptian eaters. A rather interesting comment, and worthy of further discussion, I would think. And some people just eat things that Galen thinks are positively unhealthy, dogs and camels, for example. Now, a word on how he thinks nutrition works. And food, in his understanding, as I say here, replaces lost energy. The body uses energy to heat itself in movement. It uses energy, and we would say calories are needed to replace the lost energy. Galen calls this trophère, food, nutrition. And that nutrition will maintain the body in a healthy state, provided that it is ideal for the body that is eating it, that is consuming it. And the human digestion is activated by the body heat. The body heat processes the food in a process of cooking or pepsis. And if it works ideally, the good digestive system will keep the body in balance and produce good humor. So the body will stay as it was. There are dangers of imbalances and bad humor. Bad humor being something like phlegm or yellow bile, which is in the wrong place. There's either too much of it, or it's forms residues in parts of the body under the skin or in organs where it shouldn't be. But if the body converts by its heat the food perfectly, then perfect nutrition will be achieved. And there'll be no disruption to the mixture of qualities, the qualities of hot, cold, wet, and dry, which constitute the mixture and the substance of the body. So foods have a mixture of those qualities. And Galen thinks that many foods are in fact unhealthy. They unbalance the body, they produce bad humor, and this applies to almost all green plants. Again, this is really interesting, and I'll come back to this. Now, this slide looks at food from a Platonic point of view. Many of you will remember that in his Gorgias, Plato distinguishes between the cook who produces food to please people and a doctor who produces medicine, or in this case, food as well, for their benefit, to keep them healthy. And there's a potential problem here for Galen because in ancient thinking, flavor, things tasting nice, was something that the cook does, and the doctor, and we still think in a conventional way that doctors will give us bad tasting medicine to make us better. So medicine shouldn't necessarily taste good, but that's not Galen's view. So we need to have flavor on the cooking side and on the medical side. And this passage is very redolent of Plato's Gorgias. So Galen lists a series of foods which he calls pungent, drimus. These are the alliums, the garlic leeks and wild leeks. They are flavorings, but they have no food value. There's no calories, we would say. And there's also rue, hyssop, oregano, fennel, and coriander. These are strong flavors regarding which there has been discussion in cookery books, which in a way are common to physicians and cooks, as Plato said. But each has a specific aim and purpose. For we physicians aim at benefits from foods, not at pleasure. But since the unpleasantness of some foods contributes largely to poor concoction, in this regard it is best that they are moderately pleasant or tasty. But for cooks, pleasantness, for the most part, makes use of harmful seasonings so that poor rather than good concoction accompanies them. Really interesting. Flavor is essential to Galen, and it's a way in which you can identify what the properties of a food or a drug are. And in his drug book, Simple Medicines, the whole of book 4 is devoted to flavors. So this is an important medical development of Plato's division between pleasure and something that is useful. The pleasant cook, the useful doctor have the same interest in flavor. I'm just going to go briefly through a few standard elements of any diet. So cereals, Galen says, well, you have to consider what the wheat grains are like. Are they yellow or paler? Are they really dense or porous? He tends to favor the hard wheats, the very dense wheats. But he doesn't just think of wheat as a nutritionist might, he thinks of it processed. What is the purity of the flour? How much of the bran is in it? How much of the coating of the seeds? Galen is thinking very much of white bread rather than brown bread, since white bread was such a rare thing in the ancient world. He's thinking of leavened bread with yeast. He's thinking of how it is processed by the baker and the uniformity of the cooking process. If it's cooked wrongly, it won't be properly cooked inside, and the outside will be burnt in the oven. So he's interested in the cooking process as well as the wheat itself. As I mentioned before, that the cooking process prepares an unsuitable food for human consumption and the human digestion through heating. Galen thought barley was less nutritious than wheat. That is not the view of modern nutritionists, as I understand it. He's very interested in the primitive wheats, as opposed to bread wheat, einkorn, emmer, and spelt, with the regional emphasis that bread wheat does not grow well in many parts of the Mediterranean. Emmer was important in early Rome, it's important in Asia Minor, and many people could simply survive better on primitive wheats because they needed less rich soil. Similarly, there was rye in northern Greece and millet, as I mentioned, in modern Georgia, the Eastern Black Sea. And together with cereals were beans and pulses. And this was the strategy to cover failures in harvest. Peter Garnsey said wheat harvest is likely to fail 1 year in 4, barley harvest 1 year in 7. How do small farmers deal with these failures in the harvest? Well, they have beans and pulses to cover them. And a lot of modern interest has gone on Risk and Survival, the book by Tom Gallant, for example, these strategies. And Galen also is concerned about what the eaters are not all the same. So something doesn't just have a standard nutritional value, as you might read on the back of a food packet now. So he's talking about people who harvesters, people who dig ditches, very heavy manual work. When they're hungry, they eat bread and cheese together. Very bad idea, says Galen. The depleted flesh snatches up from the stomach, not only half concocted, but even when they work after a meal, sometimes absolutely unconcocted food, chyme. This is why these people later suffer very troublesome illnesses and die before they reach old age. And Galen says a bit later in this passage, they're fine if they sleep properly. They get over this difficulty, but they have to eat so quickly, they are so hungry that the food has not been half digested, sometimes not digested at all. But they are forced to eat, and that food is very unsuitable. So people don't necessarily eat in a way that is best for them, as indeed is widely seen in the modern world, but circumstances force them to eat in this way. And Galen takes this into account. He's not just interested in people swanning around at imperial symposia, eating elegantly and choosing what they can eat. And there's another very interesting example about country people where Galen records a visit with his friends in the countryside. And they come across some peasants who are working in the fields, and they've finished, the country people have finished all the bread that the women had prepared for them earlier. And when these strangers turn up, they give them some wheat porridge. And they were hungry again. Galen says, we ate it with gusto and felt a heaviness in the stomach. We suffered from lack of appetite, headaches and blurred vision. This was a very unsuitable food. Were the country people playing a prank on them? Did they themselves ever eat boiled wheat? And how were they affected? And they said they'd often eaten it under the same necessity that we had experienced, and that food prepared in this way was a heavy food, difficult to concoct. That's rather Galen the scientist. He's looking not at how things are ideally eaten, but how they are eaten under necessity. And Galen loves these anecdotes to show that he's really on the case. He's interested in the human body, not just the affectations of the wealthy. And he has this wonderful anecdote about this country meeting. Then if we move on to meat, an example, pork is the most nutritious of all foods. And he again goes for quite an extreme version, somebody who needs a huge amount of nutrition, athletes. After identical exercises, if they take the same amount of a different food that is not pork on one day, straight away on the following day, they appear not only weaker, but also obviously less well fed. So it's a pretty good test of the nutritious benefits of pork. You can make the same test to the statement in the case of youths being worked hard in the wrestling school. So the youths in the wrestling school, these are elite boys. The athletes could be elite people or gladiators, not elite at all. And people carrying out any forceful and energetic activity whatsoever, like that of ditch diggers. Again, he's gone to heavy manual workers. Pork is the most nutritious, but it has difficulties. It's more glutinous than beef. So beef is very nutritious, but might produce residues. Pork is easy to digest, better for concoction. And for people in their prime who are working hard, you need the mature animal. For other people, for the young, for the old, Galen also thought women didn't work very hard, by the way, possibly for women, that from animals, it's best to have younger pigs for such people. Now, I mentioned earlier that fruit and vegetables are not considered very nutritious by Galen. But he also wants to be really precise, and I've chosen the example of apples. And in a very interesting item on apples, he said they may be sour, harsh, sharp, sweet, or bitter, or a mixture of any of these. In other words, the effect, the flavor, and implicitly the quality of the apple is going to be very different depending on how ripe it is. So sour apples, astringent apples, they tighten a relaxed stomach. They might be good if you're suffering from diarrhea. Whereas sharp apples cut through thick humours in the stomach and help to evacuate it. So these are the same apple at a different stage of development can have a contrary effect on the stomach. Sweet apples are the best distributed through throughout the body, and that is because in Galen's thinking, sweet things are not normally the most nutritious. And he also notes that apples sweeten on the tree in the sun's heat. So you can see the way that heat works on the apple in the natural world, and something cooling transforms into something warming. So we can't just say, oh, well, apples are cooling and sour. Quite interesting detail in the case of the apple. Here we come back to the red mullet. And you'll remember the use of pleasant words in the passage influenced by Plato. And he says the flesh of the red mullet is pleasant. This is a gourmet food in the ancient world. And so it's not surprising that it's pleasant. But, says Galen, it is also appropriate nourishment, oikeia. It's appropriate, is entirely suitable for the nature of the human body. It's firmer than the flesh of other fish and can be eaten every day because it's friable. It's not oily and it has a little pungency. Then he mentions these luxurious types who marvel at the pleasure offered by the liver of red mullet, but in my opinion, it does not seem so pleasant as to merit such a reputation, nor is it beneficial for the body. So the gourmet interest is entirely trivial and beneath Galen's notice. But the mullet is a wild food. It's pleasant and entirely suitable for the human body. You can eat it every day and be close to an ideal form of nourishment. Galen on food shortages, his treatise on good and bad juices, which is closely linked to the capacities of food, he refers there to the seasonal deficits, the hungry spring in the Mediterranean world. Towns take food from country people. The market forces people in the country to go down the food chain and even to eat wild and raw foods. And therefore, in the spring, they develop terrible skin conditions. And Galen says this is very unpleasant, but it's better than damage to the internal organs, which can be fatal. So you need the bad humors to gather underneath the skin rather than attacking the liver and kidneys, for example. This is a real problem in rural areas. Galen is our best source on that. And we have some examples now of country people who are forced to eat food normally reserved for animals. So the bitter vetch is an example. And we might say, well, why has Galen included this information? Is he using country people as a sort of guinea pig or testing them in some way? Well, it shows the limits of the human diet as opposed to what other animals can eat. It shows that plants have drug-like qualities rather than food qualities for human consumers. I mentioned earlier that nearly all green plants are drug-like rather than nourishing in Galen's view. And Galen is talking about the whole diet, whereas a modern nutritionist has vitamins and proteins and minerals and all those things. Galen includes these things as drug qualities rather than food qualities. So here's here are a few unsuitable foods for human beings, but farmers are forced to eat them. So the tare and vetch, these are weeds in cornfields. Farmers store them, sometimes with the pods. They're used to feed animals. But he's aware, Galen knows that people eat them when there's a food shortage, especially in the spring while they're still green, like chickpeas and beans that were more commonly eaten by human beings. The taste is unpleasant. You'll remember this is a sign that it's difficult to concoct and it's costive, not easy to pass through the human digestion. It's obvious that being of such a nature, the nutriment distributed from them is thick and of a bad humor, kakokkumos, being fit for the generation of blood that is black-biled, as has been stated previously about lentils. So human beings need to avoid this, but it's showing you how the nutritional system works. And similarly with acorns, and more interestingly, there's famine in the land. People were forced to eat the pigs, to kill the pigs because there wasn't enough beech mast and medlars. And the country people had to eat the pig food, the beech mast and the medlars and the acorns. So they slaughtered the pigs and ate them. Then they opened the pits, and having suitably prepared the mass in various ways, they ate it. And this is how they cooked it. They boiled it. They covered it with hot ash, baked it moderately. They could make a soup from it. Again, it's interested in all these processes. They crushed it and pounded it smooth, pouring in honey or boiling it with milk. And then he says the nutriment from it is abundant. It's very, very nutritious. But the food from it is slow to pass and has a thick juice. So it's not suitable for human beings. Or it will have side effects, but it is very nutritious. Again, it's helping us to see how his nutritional thinking is working. Now, the Herculaneum sewer has been investigated by archaeologists in the last 20 years, people in Oxford. And it's really interesting because the food remains in the sewer were preserved by the heat of the volcanic explosion from Vesuvius. And the sewer runs under a row of flats with shops underneath. So these are certainly not elite eaters. It's what, and the remains are what has passed through the human gut. And it's not just some ridiculous ideas by elite writers. And it shows a very varied diet and quite a lot of fish. So there's a suggestion in satirical writers, Horace or Juvenal, ideological writers, that the Romans didn't eat fish. It's just a Greek idea, and it's a very bad thing for corrupt, wealthy people. Not the case in the Bay of Naples. They ate a lot of fish. They also ate varied cereals, not just wheat, but primitive wheats, lots of fruits and nuts. And as far as I can see, the findings of the archaeologists matches Galen's description of the diet pretty closely. That's Galen matching up with the archaeology really nicely. Okay, he's an elite writer, but he knows what he's talking about as far as the diet is concerned. So what might we conclude from this very, very brief survey? He has his pharmacological theory within which nutrition rests. And foods might maintain the body, or they might have pharmacological impacts and change the body, but he's interested in the diet as it was eaten and not interested in fancy things from abroad. Wheat is the most important, but many other cereals are essential to the diet. He presents, I haven't spoken about this, but there are a wide range of animals and fish and parts of animals. The combs of hens, the feet, the ears, or the trotters of pigs. He's interested in the parts of animals as part of the diet. There's that very close match between the archaeology and Galen's survey. He has a lot of unsuitable foods that people are forced to eat because of shortages, and he understands those shortages and why they come about, urban pressures on country people. He talks to farmers. He has a scientific interest. He doesn't dismiss country people as ignorant. He can see why they are eating as they do. He has a comprehensive social range. At the same time, he's a very he's an authoritative imperial writer full of his own importance. So he presents the best science as he understands it, but he's interested in the human body, and that means he's not just interested in things that wealthy people might do. And I think when Galen's nutritional treatises were transmitted in later antiquity and into the Middle Ages, when they were summarized, the regional detail and the anecdotes, I think, were stripped out, and similar things happened with the pharmacology, with simple medicines. There's much more interest in the food detail, how a doctor could use this instruction in a practical way, rather than having the detail. But I think the anecdotes and the regional detail add essential information from the point of view of modern scholars. Thank you for your attention.